Lots of discussion in the US and the UK at the moment about whether China's economy is socialist or capitalist.
What is China? Capitalist or socialist?
Is China a capitalist economy?
Look, it's difficult to characterize China as capitalist or socialist.
A lot of people on the left in particular are arguing that China is socialist.
Today I'm going to be talking about how China's socialist system actually works. The system is still socialist.
There's been a very decisive shift back towards socialism.
They tend to focus on things like state ownership and how China lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But they usually don't talk very much about the situation of ordinary workers. In other words, how labour is organised. And I don't just mean whether the situation for workers is good or bad, or even whether it's getting better or worse, although these are important issues. I really mean, what is the relationship between people and the companies they work for? In this video, I'll be giving the point of view of a sociologist, China expert and professor of labour studies at Cornell University. His name is Eli Friedman. He's very well known in his field. He's written several books on Chinese workers and he's coming from a socialist position himself. So he's not just some China basher who is out to try to prove how the democratic system of the United States is superior. In fact, he's highly critical of the labour regime in the United States as well. So because he doesn't have that kind of built-in bias, I think he's a good person to pay attention to. But first, why does it matter whether China is capitalist or socialist? It matters because as China is rapidly becoming one of the major players on the world stage, we need to work out what kind of country it is. We need to do this so that we can understand its role in the world and how it interacts with other countries. For example, how should we understand the rivalry going on at the moment between the United States and China? Is this an ideological struggle between the competing ideals of liberal democracy versus socialism? Or is it something else? Friedman definitely thinks it's something else, and we'll get to that a bit later on. First of all, here's Friedman talking about why it is that so many people who aren't all that familiar with China think that it's socialist.
I think for people who have spent a lot of time living in China, or particularly for leftists who've spent time living and working in China, it kind of seems like a non-issue, right? You go to China and people intuitively understand it as being part of global capitalism. But I understand that it is not intuitive. And one of the reasons that it's not intuitive, which is really important to acknowledge at the outset, is that it is still controlled by a Communist Party that refers to its system as socialist.
So the Chinese party state or government calls itself socialist. And if you're on the left, then you probably believe that it's important to take people's own lived experiences seriously. Just like the slogan, "Believe Women," was a rallying cry for the Me Too movement. So if the Chinese say they're socialist, it's not the place of outsiders to say that's not true. Fair enough. But the point Friedman is making here is that what many on the left outside China are doing is taking the language of the Chinese state at face value. In other words, if China's leaders say China is socialist, then it must be, but they don't apply the same standards to liberal democracies that they're probably very critical of.
Part of what we're doing here is trying to encourage people to approach the statements of the Chinese state with the same kind of level of critical engagement that you might engage with the United States when, for instance, Joe Biden says we are a democracy. So the fact that Joe Biden says America is a democracy is relevant for understanding politics in the United States, but that doesn't mean that you say, oh, well, it's democratic, right? The same way when Xi Jinping says China is a socialist state, I think we should approach that skeptically and try to understand exactly what's going on.
So what exactly is Friedman's starting point for arguing that China is capitalist? He starts in the same place that Marx does. Marx begins Das Kapital Volume 1 by talking about the commodity. In other words, anything which is exchanged on a market. This doesn't mean that any society which has commodities is capitalist. Commodity exchange was around thousands of years before capitalism developed. People were exchanging things by bartering before there was even money to exchange to buy things. So you can have commodity markets in non-capitalist societies. But According to Marx, once the exchange of commodities and moreover the production of commodities, that is, making things in order to sell them, takes over to such an extent that society as a whole becomes organised around that central goal, then you have what Marx referred to as the capitalist mode of production. Marx put it like this. This is the very first sentence of Das Kapital, Volume 1. The wealth of societies dominated by the capitalist mode of production appears in the form of an enormous accumulation of commodities. The individual commodity appears as the elementary form of that wealth. Hence, our investigation begins by analysing the commodity. Once the production of commodities is central to how your economy and society is organised, all kinds of things follow from that. Companies have to compete with each other to sell commodities, and to do that, they need to constantly pursue profits, which they reinvest in an endless cycle of seeking profits and reinvesting. Once you have that, you have capitalism. Here's Friedman again talking about how China's economy is organised.
And so the question is, how are things being produced? Are they being produced as commodities or not? And if we look at contemporary China, we can see that production is being organized around the commodity form, right? And this doesn't matter if we're talking about basic human necessities, food, medicine and medical equipment. Housing critically in China is produced as a commodity. That is the case, right? So production is organized around the production of commodities.
And what's more, under the capitalist mode of production, people become commodities as well. They have to sell their labour, that is their time, in order to survive. In other words, they don't have a stable livelihood that they can just rely on. They have to actively go onto the labour market and find someone to sell their labour to. I think a lot of people now take this for granted as just how all societies work, but it wasn't always like this. And just a few decades ago, it wasn't like this in China. The fact is, once this becomes the principal way that society is organised, this is specifically capitalist. Here's Friedman on this.
Everyone's born into a society. How do they go about surviving? Well, in China, people go about surviving the same way that they do in the United States or France or Brazil or other countries that we all understand to be capitalist, which is to say, the overwhelming majority of people have to sell their labor power in order to survive. The only property that they have is their own labor power. They go out, they get a job, they get wages in exchange, and then they take those wages to buy the things that they need in order to be able to reproduce themselves. So I've already said that housing is a commodity. You need money in order to buy housing. Healthcare is not provided as a right? So the healthcare system is a little bit complicated, but you talk to Chinese people, everybody understands they need to save money in order to pay for all kinds of health expenses and all of the other things that one needs to survive. Those things have to be purchased on the market, right? So that is a proletarian situation.
Now, something we hear quite a lot is that because China has a large state-owned sector, in other words, it has a lot of state-owned enterprises or SOEs, this means it's socialist. It's true that state ownership of corporations in China is far higher than other countries. It's about 25 to 30% of the overall economy. In the US and the UK, I think because of the particular stage of capitalism we're currently in, which places so much emphasis on privatization, we tend to forget that capitalist economies haven't always been like this and don't have to be. I'm going to quote now from Friedman's book, China in Global Capitalism, which he wrote along with several co-authors. There is no doubt that Chinese state intervention in the economy is more extensive than is the case in most other countries. But before the current neoliberal period in which privatization became common, SOEs were a common feature of many capitalist societies. During the mid-20th century, for example, state-owned industries were widespread in Europe, India, and even Kuomintang-controlled Taiwan, where SOEs contributed nearly 1/4 of the country's GDP as late as the 1980s. In fact, late developing capitalist economies have always used state ownership and state protectionism in attempting to establish capitalist corporations and to ensure their competitiveness. Even the US did so when it won independence from Britain. Later, during the Second World War, the federal government subordinated private capital to the dictates of the war economy, financed corporate investment, and set prices and wages. State intervention oriented toward enhancing efficiency, profitability, and predictability is not antithetical to capitalism, but has been and is still a strategy states use to ensure their economic stability, competitiveness, growth, and profitability. And to bash the point home, they also have this great quote from Friedrich Engels, who said this on how capitalism can work perfectly well under state ownership. The modern state, whatever its form, is an essentially capitalist machine. It is the state of the capitalists, the ideal collective body of all capitalists. The more productive forces it takes over as its property, the more it becomes the real collective body of all the capitalists, the more citizens it exploits. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relationship is not abolished, it is rather pushed to an extreme. Here's Friedman again on Chinese state-owned enterprises.
It's really important to understand that even those SOEs are oriented towards profit, because what we see is the way that the state is behaving, both domestically and internationally, is in the interest of the accumulation of wealth for those corporations. But the fact ultimately that they are nominally owned by the state doesn't actually affect that behavior, right? That they're out there trying to extract profits, including from their own workforce. And critically, and there's lots of debates about how to think about socialism, even if they are owned by the state, the workers themselves don't actually exercise any kind of democratic governance over those firms, and that's quite clear. These are dictatorial organizations.
Okay, so people have to go out and get jobs for a living, and they may not have much power in the workplace. But you may be thinking, it's not all bad. China did lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, right? So clearly, the party state does care about the people.
China has lifted 700 million people out of poverty since 2000. It's done that by having an active socialist state.
China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. This is the world's greatest poverty reduction campaign in human history.
Fair point. Here's how Friedman tackles this question.
China was socialist first. And so what you saw in China in the 1980s is that you have a country that is pretty poor in terms of GDP output, but has relatively good human development, right? Literacy, investments in health, et cetera, and is quite equal. And China goes from being a very equal country in the mid-1980s to being, it's kind of like Nordic levels of equality, to being one of the most unequal countries in the world, measured by Gini coefficient, by the 21st century, especially by, let's say, by 2008 or so, right? So just a really astronomical, like very, very, very quick increase in inequality in a short period of time. And so I think that that's really significant for understanding the kind of the social dynamics and what people have experienced there in recent decades. One thing that we hear a lot is that China has lifted 600 million people or 800 million people out of poverty or whatever it is. And I don't want to undermine the significance of what has happened there over the last 40 years. It is very impressive, and just about everybody, their life is materially better than it would have been 40 years ago. That being said, it's also really important to keep in mind that when people are citing that, they're using the World Bank definition of living on, $1.90 or less per day. And so what you see in the 1980s and 1990s especially is you see the destruction of the non-marketized forms of social reproduction, access to free housing, free healthcare, the emergence of a labor market that then pays people. And it's, yes, people's wages have gone up. They're now making more money than they were in the 1980s, but they don't have to pay for their housing and their healthcare, right? So if we look at it in sort of relative terms, I think that transition from a poor kind of socialist kind of economy to a much richer capitalist economy is not in kind of social terms the miracle that it might that it sometimes seems to be when you're looking at in terms of GDP production.
So what he's saying here is the point of whether or not China is socialist is not about whether people's lives have got better and living standards have gone up. It's about how the whole of the economy and society is organised. And like we talked about at the beginning, it's all organised around making and buying commodities and working for a wage, which it wasn't before, and that's why it isn't socialist. But why does this matter? Why does it matter what we call China's economy? Friedman says this: if we really think China's socialist, we have no way to really understand its behaviour on the world stage, including the rivalry with the United States. Again, to quote Friedman and his co-authors, the emerging conflict with the US is profoundly shaped by the pressures of global capitalist competition. Mistaking this as an ideological struggle between socialism and capitalism would lead to analytical and strategic dead ends. An ideological struggle framework proves useless in explaining the recent tit-for-tat technology war that has seen the US ban the export of a range of advanced semiconductors and semiconductor production hardware, while China has responded by controlling the export of gallium and germanium, two metals used in a range of high technology components. The US is not limiting technology exports out of a concern for democracy. On the other hand, China is clearly pursuing leadership in 5G, AI, and semiconductors so it can capture a growing share of the global market. And it's limiting the export of key metals is to damage US firms rather than to advance socially responsive technology. Interstate conflict is being driven significantly by political elites' desire to secure profitability for their respective corporations. We need to be crystal clear that the Chinese state's opposition to the US-led order is about asserting its interests in global capitalism, not advancing a socially emancipatory politics against that system. Thank you for watching.